Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth webinar in our third series of virtual tours. How are you all this evening? Are any of you thinking of traveling again like I am? We can feel a renewed interest and renewed energy with a few people inquiring once again about tours and wondering when it'll be possible for us to get on a plane again, fly to some country beyond North America. Well, we are tentatively getting excited about the possibilities, but until that time, and until it's the right time, and we're being very cautious, let's keep things interesting with our virtual tours. We have so enjoyed all of your participation and your comments and questions, and I'm sure tonight will be no different. Our topic tonight is exploring questions from the Mennonite past. And I am delighted to introduce you to John Thiesen, who has been the Archivist and Co-Director of Libraries at Bethel College since 1990. He grew up in Newton, Kansas. He is a graduate of Bethel College and Wichita State University and has done additional graduate work in history at the University of Kansas. He is a member of the Academy of Certified Archivists and has held the record high score on their archival certification exam since 1997. Yay! John is the author of Mennonite and Nazi: Attitudes Among Mennonite Colonists in Latin America, 1933 to 1945. He is editor or co-editor of several volumes, most recently, European Mennonites and the Holocaust. John also works part-time in software development and has a level 1 certification with the Tripoli Rocketry Association. His wife, Barbara, is the other co-director of libraries at Bethel College and a certified yoga instructor. Their son is a high school band teacher. And one last interesting fact, John and his family have had Norwegian elk hounds for more than 35 years. And if you want to know what a Norwegian elk hound looks like, check on Google. They're gorgeous. John, we are looking forward to your presentation this evening.
Okay, thank you, Audrey. Welcome to everybody to the Mennonite Library and Archives at Bethel College, North Newton, Kansas. We are located here on land that was the traditional homeland of the Wichita people, and in the region a little to the north and east of us, also the Kaw and Osage, and I'll come back to that theme a little bit later here. The purpose of the Mennonite Library and Archives is to help people answer questions about the past, specifically about the Mennonite past, and especially about the past of Mennonites who currently live in the Plain States and Western US, and about Mennonite institutions such as Bethel College, the Western District Area Conference, and several other area conferences, and about many Mennonite congregations, and also about Mennonite individuals and families. And the past can range from 500 years ago to this morning. Our public area, which you might have gotten a little walkthrough if you looked at the trailer video I did for this program, our public area has gotten a little bit cluttered during COVID since we haven't had the public into the reading area, and it has gotten used as a work area for various projects, including preparing lots of things for being scanned and digitized to answer email questions. So here's our exterior at a different time of year, something a little more pleasant to look at. We're also home here to the Mennonite Polish Studies Association, which continues the work of the Mennonite Polish Friendship Group that Peter J. Clausen and Alan Peters used to have in Fresno. We focus on the story of Mennonites from the Vistula Delta and Vistula River Valley in what is today Poland. Immigrants from that area who came to North America in the 1870s and 80s mostly came to Kansas and Nebraska, so that story is relevant here that maybe is less so in some other Mennonite communities, although the Vistula Delta story, of course, is the origin of the Russian Mennonite story. But we've done work at translating some of the older German publications from years past on the Vistula Delta story. We've worked at collecting some archival materials, and we're also continuing the tours that the previous Friendship Association used to do. Here you can see a group of our tourists in one of the cemeteries in the Vistula Delta area. Fortunately, the photo doesn't show you how many mosquitoes there were there. So our particular focus on the tours has been helping tour participants find the locations out in the countryside, the villages and cemeteries and other spots where their ancestors came from. So a lot of traveling around in the countryside rather than the cities and main travel routes. We did have a tour planned for this summer, but I'm guessing that probably still won't work out. So maybe fall, or if those of you who are interested, we would be planning a summer 2022 tour. So think about that. Now back to the archives more generally. We work to help people answer questions by collecting and preserving documents in a wide variety of formats, such as books, periodicals, photos, audio and video recordings, institutional records, personal papers such as letters and diaries, electronic records. For other kinds of three-dimensional objects and artifacts, we cooperate closely with the Coffin Museum. And if you've been on the other presentations in the series, you've seen their presentation already. I sort of enjoy statistics and counting things because it kind of gives you a sort of false sense of precision. So here's some statistics. We've got 13,571 boxes in the archives, which amounts to 6,953 cubic feet. There's about 17 million pages. We've got 4.4 terabytes of electronic records, which is 1,837,711 files. And we've got 30,556 book titles, 37,572 book volumes, since some titles are multiple volumes, over 2,000 periodical titles, 9,600 periodical volumes, several thousand other items like audio and video recordings and student seminar papers and so on. And of course, all of those numbers would have changed since I wrote them down, since there's a constant adding and subtracting of materials every day, more or less. So people have questions about the past all the time, and sometimes they're even willing to put out some effort to try to answer them. People often think of the Mennonite historical centers as places for family history primarily, and that is a certain percentage of the questions that we help answer, but it is less than a majority of the questions. And by the way, on that topic, the PBS show Finding Your Roots, which you might be familiar with, is apparently having a Russian Mennonite connected episode coming up in the 2022 season, which we've had some questions about here. So sometimes people's questions relate to hot button contentious issues one way or another, as we'll see. So most Mennonites in our region come from an immigrant settler past, as I've already suggested in talking about Vistula Delta immigrants. It's probably still the case that the majority of our personal papers collections here, things like letters and diaries and so on, come from people who were first or second generation immigrants. I'm a second generation immigrant, and older Mennonites around here still have memories of the younger 1870s immigrants, people who died in the 1930s and 40s. So immigration is part of the Mennonite consciousness here in a way that it isn't in some other Mennonite communities. And of course, more obviously, we have Hispanic Mennonite congregations with backgrounds in Mexico and Central America, and also a few Asian and African congregations, and also Low German Mennonites from Mexico here in Kansas. So what's one of the most basic things that happens when someone immigrates? They come to some place where other people already are. You can't migrate anywhere where there aren't already people. So immigrants to this area came to land that had been lived on by Native Americans for thousands of years and had been taken away from them. Most of the Native Americans from this area were forced onto reservations in what is now Oklahoma, just to the south of us. So certain Mennonites in the late 19th century were obsessively interested in missions, and these Mennonite immigrant groups of the 1870s and others who had been here a bit longer began the first North American Mennonite foreign mission, as they called it, in 1880, less than 10 years after some of them had actually arrived here. And that was started in what is today Oklahoma, which was then called Indian Territory, at a little town called Darlington. And here you can see a contemporary Darlington photo. This was about a day or two overland travel south from the new Mennonite communities in central Kansas. It was on the Cheyenne and Arapaho reservation. This Mennonite involvement with Native Americans has resulted in the Mennonite Library and Archives becoming known among researchers well outside of Mennonite circles. Persons doing research on the Native American languages and cultures with which General Conference missions were involved. And this is because the General Conference missionaries were somewhat unusual in putting a lot of effort into learning Native language and culture. They didn't just rely on interpreters like many other mission groups working with Native Americans did. One name and connection with this was Rodolphe Petter. He was a Swiss man, not of Mennonite background, who got acquainted with Swiss Mennonites during his compulsory military service, oddly enough, and eventually married into the group, and then came to the US in 1890 in order to be a missionary. Petter spent his life learning and studying the Cheyenne language and culture, first in Oklahoma and later in Montana, producing grammars and translations in this huge dictionary. We have Petter's photo collection posted online, which makes it available to Mennonite communities who can't necessarily make arrangements to come here in person. Also in Petter's papers is a collection of some of the Native American ledger drawings, the traditional artwork, late 20th or late 19th, early 20th century. So in March 2015, I had what I think of as the high point of my archival career. I visited the Hopi tribal offices, specifically the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office. I had to give an impromptu speech with about an hour's notice. And this occasion was because of another Mennonite missionary well known outside of Mennonite circles. That was H.R. Voth, Heinrich R. Voth. Voth began in Darlington and came to be in charge of the Mennonite missions in Oklahoma, Indian Territory in the late 1880s and early 1890s. And then in 1893, he began a new Mennonite mission effort at Aribe in what is now northeast Arizona. I think this is actually Voth here in this Darlington picture down in the corner there. Voth was an avid learner of languages and cultures. He had worked some on Arapaho while he was in Oklahoma, and he was already in touch with the emerging field of anthropology at that time, people like James Mooney, for example. Voth was an avid collector of artifacts, partly to collect everyday objects in order to learn the languages. And he was also apparently sort of a gadget person. He was an early adopter of cameras, although unfortunately he wasn't an early adopter of typewriters. His handwriting is terrible. So once he got to Aribe, he got functional in the language within the first few months, really. Carefully observed ceremonies that happened there. He got one of the first film cameras produced as opposed a film camera as opposed to a glass plate camera, and he photographed everyday life and ceremonies. And here he is preaching in Oribe using a poster to show Bible stories. And so actually some of his posters that he used were in German. So you have this odd combination of languages here, an English-speaking political system, a German-speaking missionary, and a Hopi-speaking community that he's talking to. So eventually, through both anthropological contexts, he got started publishing his observations and photos in Hopi society and the other similar Puebloan societies in the Southwest. The ceremonies are the property of various clans and societies. The details are supposed to be private and aren't supposed to be known to those outside of the owning group. So eventually, as Hopis came to be more linked into broader American culture, the awareness of Oath's publications and his work with museums came back to the Hopis and caused a lot of conflict. It wasn't that, that the Hopis were unaware of Oath taking photos and taking notes. It seems like he was tolerated because they didn't quite know what to do with him, sort of a weird white guy who learned their language and was interested in their culture and argued with them about religion and sometimes helped defend them against impositions from other whites, such as the land allotment attempt. But over time, both came to be reviled by Hopis because of how he had made public these private ceremonies. So there are around 2,200 both negatives. Not nearly all of them are ceremonial, but a substantial portion are. And the film available in the late 19th, early 20th century was cellulose nitrate. This is an example of one of his later negatives. So nitrate, which is very flammable, can spontaneously combust. You may have seen some of the news stories occasionally about old movie films catching fire. So we store the negatives in a freezer here. There were a number of other people, researchers at that time, also taking photos of ceremonies and so on, but both had much better access because he lived there full time and because he spoke the language. So our archives has had a relationship with the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office since 1994. When they came here, staff members came here to review the both papers and also reviewed the handful of Hopi artifacts that the Coffin Museum has. And they've occasionally asked for copies of photos for their use over the years since then. In 2011, they had asked for a number of photos for an exhibit they were doing about traditional agriculture. And so I digitized those negatives for them. And it occurred to me at that time that technology had gotten to the point where it would be possible to scan all of the photos to hand over to them. And this would have been possible earlier. The scanning would have been possible a long time earlier, but the only way to transfer them would have been on large stacks of DVDs or something inconvenient like that. So in 2011, I started experimenting, and over the course of 3 years, digitized all of the surviving both photos. So then I consulted with the preservation office about this and said that I wanted to transfer these scans to them so they could make use of them and have them under their control rather than ours. And it turned out that by 2014, I could fit all of these onto one 128 gigabyte thumb drive. So I asked them how I should transfer that drive to them. I could simply ship it. I didn't want to make a big deal out of something that might not be as important to them. But the Hopi archivist at that time, who's now the director of the preservation office, told me, follow your heart, which was kind of a surprising thing to say. So I decided to drive out there and deliver this thumb drive in person which later I heard through the grapevine was kind of the right decision. It was seen as showing respect by actually coming out to them in person, taking the effort to make a long trip out there to be present in person. So I had just expected to visit the preservation office and maybe shake hands with a couple of administrators. But when we got to the tribal offices, I heard that we were going to go in front of a council meeting, more or less their state legislature. And so I had to make an impromptu speech explaining the Voth story and what I was doing there. And it also offered the preservation office an opportunity to be in front of their funding agency and advertise their own work too. And the person there with me is Lee Kwan Wisioma, who was the head of the preservation office at that time, was the founder of the preservation office there. And so we did another similar presentation to staff people after lunch in the various offices. It was a really fascinating experience. A Mennonite archivist and historian speaking to a Native American governing body, and not something I would have ever expected to do, even just a few days before it happened. So this kind of thing is sometimes called digital repatriation. I'm not really sure I like that term. Repatriation is a word that's been used mostly in terms of artifacts rather than documents. But I hope this does contribute to some kind of sense of reparation or rebalancing of understandings or something like that. So immigrants come to a setting, but immigrants also bring baggage with them. So here's a copy of Mein Kampf, which was owned. Let me get a drink here. So here's a copy of Mein Kampf, which was owned by a Mennonite church member here in Kansas, an immigrant from Russia. So you can see it's got a birthday inscription. It's got paper clips in it that indicate somebody was reading it. It's got a bookmark from the 1939 Kansas State Sunday School Convention. So the owner of this book came from Crimea, sort of. He was actually born in Hamburg in Germany, while his father was attending the Baptist seminary there. But then the family went back to Ukraine and then moved back to Germany in 1910. But he, the book's owner, returned to Crimea in time to be in the medical and quartermaster service in the Russian military during World War I, then got married and fled with his own family in 1919, going back to Germany, then migrated to the US from Germany in 1926 when a lot of his relatives were moving to southern Manitoba. He went back to Germany in 1939 for several months, at least that was the plan, and ended up staying until 1947 and began the gathering of refugees in Berlin that the famous Peter Dick later took credit for. And then he went back to the US. There were a lot more people than we really realize with this kind of complicated migration history, people going back and forth to all sorts of different locations of refuge or safety or hoped for new opportunities. And Nazism was attractive to people in this time period because of its violent anti-communism. It was also troubling because of its contempt, at least in some setting, contempt for Christianity, which people like him, the owner of the book, only gradually recognized, and troubling for its open anti-Semitism, which people like him didn't take seriously until it was too late. So Mennonite links to Nazism go back very early. There was a Daniel Detweiler from Munich who joined the party in September 1920. You can see his name here. His membership number was 1967. Hitler had joined the party only about a year earlier. His number was 555. And Detweiler retained his party membership and church membership until he died in 1941. And this exhibit page here is labeled Adolf Hitler's Fellow Fighters, 1919 to 21. So here's Detweiler on the list. Back in March 2018, we had a conference here at Bethel on Mennonites and the Holocaust, which seems to have gotten a certain amount of continuing attention, not all of it legitimate or acceptable. And contrary to what some people seem to think, this is not some revelation or uncovering of a conspiracy. Mennonite historians have been talking about Mennonites and Nazism for decades, literally since the 1940s. And it's just that nobody else was listening to the historians until recently, when it seems to have become sort of faddish to do so. So asking questions about the Mennonite past shows that Mennonites were not isolated from world events and not isolated from contentious world events. My experience would be that Mennonites often study the past in a Mennocentric sort of way, as if the world revolves around Mennonites, but it doesn't. 99.9% of the time, Mennonites are insignificant to the big picture of historical events. Mennonites also sometimes see the Mennonite past as exceptionalism. Mennonites as either exceptionally good, or what's more trendy these days, Mennonites as exceptionally bad. But Mennonites aren't exceptional in that sense. Mennonite questions about the past don't need that moral baggage, and that kind of moralizing baggage gets in the way of honest answers to questions about the past. What the Mennonite past is particular. It's the particular unique story or stories of a small group over the last 500 years. And that even though it isn't always terribly significant or exceptional, answering questions about the Mennonite past can be interesting and enlightening and illuminating, both for those who think of themselves as Mennonites and those who don't. So thank you for listening, and I think we'll turn it over to questions and comments at this point.
Thank you, John. That was very interesting. Wow. Let's, if you have a question, please post it in the Q&A section. We have some questions lined up already. And Walter is saying, in all the statistics, I don't recall hearing about microfilm. Possibly I missed it, but do you have some, and what areas of history are they from? Also, which of the archives are available online?
Yeah, we do have a fairly large microfilm collection, probably a couple of thousand reels, includes all sorts of things, old church records, ship passenger lists, rare books, various unpublished things. It's hard to really give a specific answer to that in a sort of way that goes deeper than just general categories. The
Could we
online
include a link in the follow-up email to some of the things that you have online that are digitized?
the digitized material, the best way to proceed is to go to our website and just start hunting around.
Okay.
That won't get everything that's been digitized, but that gives you an overview of what kinds of things are there.
Right. And Kevin and Ann are asking, did the Hopi mistrust cameras and photos at the time they were first exposed to this technology?
Well, it would be better for a Hopi historian to answer that question, but my sense is that they didn't at first because they didn't really realize what the longer term consequences would be. But the first, the first point at which it became a problem was, the 1890s were just at the very beginning of when you started to get crowds of white tourists coming to watch ceremonies. And, that was where it first became a problem, not photographs per se, but just people, clueless people wandering around the place and getting in the way.
Right.
And, eventually, fairly rapidly getting to crowds of, hundreds of people wandering around getting in the way.
Oh, but the photos showed people that that's what was there.
Well, yeah, people were aware of that in general just from written descriptions, but um, it would be a long story to explore this, but essentially it became part of the tourism operations of the Santa Fe Railroad.
Oh,
So, people came there before the railroad was very, very close, but then once the railroad made it more accessible, then you had people flooding in to see this, exotic foreign culture.
right,
And then it became a much bigger problem.
right. Thanks for putting that in context.
So, not I don't want to sound like I'm speaking for the Hopi perspective in some way. I'm just, reporting things that I've read in the historical literature or things that I've been told by people in the preservation office.
Okay, good. Thank you for clarifying. Now, Patricia is saying, you said that Peter Dick took credit for helping refugees after World War II. What was his role?
Well, the most famous MCC story is the rescue of Mennonite refugees out of Berlin and putting them on the Volendam ship and taking them to South America.
Right.
And, that is Peter Dick's story, but that began with several other people, several other MCC workers and other local people gathering refugees in Berlin before Peter Dick got there. So, C.F. Clausen was there quite a long time before Peter Dick got there. Robert Kreider was there beforehand. So, there was an accumulation. That project had gotten started already.
I see. So he was one of many who was making an impact in that.
Yeah, he was sent, sort of sent in to take over at a
Right.
certain point.
Okay. Marjorie's asking, what are the three books that best explain life in Prussia and Vistula Delta?
In English, there isn't really anything, well, I shouldn't say that. There isn't really a good comprehensive overview. Peter Clausen's book, his longer, more academic book on the Prussian Mennonite story, which I don't have the title here right in front of me, that's a good one. His shorter book that is somewhat more a tourism guide to the Vistula Delta, that one that was published in the 80s, that also can be useful. And the two translations we did, which are more, those are German publications from the 19th century. Those are you know, stylistically a little bit old-fashioned, but could be useful. The two that I showed you, the Herman Monhart's Danzig Mennonite Church, which specifically focuses on the Danzig story, and then Wilhelm Monhart's complicated title about military service and the Mennonites of provincial Prussia, this one here, which is also an English translation, which we've done in recent years. That is a little bit broader story, but style-wise, sort of old-fashioned sounding. But those are somebody posted the title here, Mennonites in Early Modern Poland and Prussia. That's Peter Clausen's longer book, which is in English is really probably the best place to start right now.
Perfect. I'm going to capture that from the chat, and we can send that one out with the follow-up email. Okay, good. The next question. Thanks for your comments on Mennonite exceptionalism, says Robert. Can you suggest ways to work past the attitudes of all good and all bad that some Mennonites have?
Well, I don't know. Is that a question for a psychologist, maybe?
Okay, we'll stick to your area of expertise. No problem.
My knee-jerk response is just to read a lot of history.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is, I mean, there's some people who do that and just don't let it sink in.
Fair enough.
There are people who read history to confirm they're either all good or all bad ideas rather than to understand how complicated and ambiguous things are.
Yes, it's good to have a well-rounded intellectual diet from a variety of perspectives to keep us all humble, right, John?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Would there be a good reference to read about the conditions that Mennonites that escaped from South Russia, New Smyrna, Lugovsk to Germany being able to leave for Kansas? The impression for my mother was life was hard there.
I'm not sure. Are we talking about the 1870s here?
I am not sure either. Maybe that's a good question to follow up with by email, where you can clarify.
I would say that if we're talking about the 1920s or 40s, there are very few of that era families that came to Kansas. I mean, my family is one from the 1920s, but very few of the 20s and 40s people came here.
Okay.
And probably less than 10 or 20 families, I would guess. If we're talking about 1870s migrations, for most of them, life there in Russia wasn't particularly hard economically at the time, and some of them were fairly well off. But there was a mix of motives. One was the changes in the legal regime, government service, threats of military service, and so on. One was just opportunities, if you needed for the younger generation needed more farmland, was that easier to find somewhere in Russia, Siberia, or was it easier to find in the US and Canada?
Right. Lyle is asking, what were some of the drawing cards for Mennonites to join the Nazi movement? Was there anything in particular that would have, or was it just people in general might be drawn to it, not necessarily that they were Mennonite?
Well, I mean, I would say for many Mennonites, violent anti-communism was the big drawing card.
Mm-hmm.
For Mennonites living in Germany over the long term in that era, it might have been a little more diffuse than that. Nationalism issues and the desire or need to kind of fit in with society in general and to be seen as normal Germans rather than as, some weird religious sect.
Right, because other people were believing in that and going along with that. Okay, we have a few questions around Mennonite indigenous relations, or Native American. I guess someone a Canadian is asking, did Americans have the same kind of residential schools for indigenous people that they did in Canada?
I'm not familiar in detail with the Canadian story, so I'm not sure quite how comparable those were. So the Mennonite mission schools, there were, first of all, there were in the 1880s and 90s, there were two schools that were both on the reservation. So my impression, there haven't been detailed histories written of those, but my impression is that they were a mixture of residential and day schools because they were on the reservation, and the reservation was a fairly large piece of territory, 100 or more miles across. So people nearby could attend school because it was within walking or riding distance, and others were much farther away.
Right.
Then for students who were somewhat more advanced, so to speak, there was a residential school at Halstead, Kansas, uh, a school specifically for Native Americans who had a connection of one kind or another with the Mennonite missions. So that was a residential school, which was, a day or two travel away from the reservation. It's interesting that a lot of the students at that school, and I'm not sure what percentage, but a lot of them were people of mixed race.
Oh,
So white and Native, or Hispanic and Native, or African American and Native. You know,
wow.
there were many people there who had already had you know a link family wise, both in Native communities and in the wider surrounding society.
I think
And
probably the person asking the question, if we're in Canada, the residential schools were very negative because Native children were taken from their homes and their culture was there was an attempt to erase their culture.
mhm.
So did Mennonites have a positive cultural relationship with Indigenous people? Was it respectful, or was it a mixed bag from your knowledge?
Well, I mean, in general, Mennonites, especially those who weren't, directly involved in the mission communities, would have obviously shared the stereotypes about Native Americans of the broader culture. They were primitive and so on and so
Mhm.
forth. Um, the schools, the narrative about schools for Native Americans in the U.S. is somewhat similar, but I think the story, when you actually look at the detail of individual schools, is fairly complicated.
Hmm.
Um, Schools such as the Mennonite ones on the reservation sometimes, you know, were told by government regulation to prohibit use of native languages. At other times, didn't prohibit use of native languages. It depended on shifting government policies, and it depended even on shifting uh, school staff, whether they cared about government policy or not, or just ignored it.
Right.
Um, the one other Mennonite mission school that needs to be mentioned to round out the picture of four schools basically is much later, from the 1950s, um, a school which still exists in some form, was known for many years as Hopi Mission School.
Hmm.
And that's another interesting example where it was the local community who asked for the Mennonites to start that school
Hmm.
because their government run or locally run school system was in terrible condition. And, you know, a privately run mission school ended up being a much better option, not just for people who were native church members, but everybody else around too. You know, a good number of the people I met in the Hopi administration and at the meeting in 2015 said, "Oh yeah, I attended." You know, middle-aged people said, "Oh yeah, I attended Hopi mission school and I sent my kids there." But you know, I have nothing good to say about the church. I'm a traditionalist. You know, Lee Kwan Wisioma, the head of the preservation office, is you know, a staunch Hopi traditionalist, and he said, "Oh yeah, I went to the mission school and I sent my kids there, and a good education and, you know, pleasant caring staff and so on." But that, you know, that, as with many things there, that has changed dramatically. You know, now the public schools on the Hopi reservation are, you know, run and staffed by the Hopi tribe, and so the educational options, you know, are still underfinanced, but are much better, much friendlier than they would have been in the 1950s.
Right. That's good to understand. Audrey's sending me some questions here from the chat. Just a reminder, we're going to be wrapping up shortly, but if you do have a final question, put it in the Q&A, not the chat. Doug Berg is asking if John knows any Mennonites who were similar to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who resisted the Nazi influence to the point of giving their life for the cause. Did you turn up anything like that in your research?
I don't know of any German Mennonites in that category. There may have been a few people among the Dutch Mennonites, Dutch Doopsinde, who could have fallen in that category. I don't know the Dutch story in quite as much detail, but I think there were a number of people who were more active in that way in Dutch Mennonite circles.
Okay. And Walter's wondering, do you know how large the Mennonite community is among Native Americans? Are there some Native American Mennonite churches?
There are a few, not just General Conference, but also Mennonite Brethren. I think some of the conservative groups, the Holdemans may have a Navajo congregation. Maybe some of the other similar conservative groups, Beachy Amish maybe, have a few. And I'm not completely familiar with those. Many of those congregations have, and I mean, I see this with the Cheyenne churches in Oklahoma. They have the same difficulties that rural white Mennonite churches have, especially ones that are farther from major metropolitan centers, is that, you know, all the kids go off to college or, you know, VOTech or the military or whatever they do after high school and don't come back because there's nothing to do. There's no economy locally. I mean, the Hopi Tribal Council and reading the Hopi newspaper, which I try to do regularly to keep track of what the preservation office is doing. And they talk about the same kinds of things that, you know, any other county commission made up of white people, like in Western Kansas or Eastern Colorado, would be talking about, you know, education, jobs, environmental issues, maintaining the healthcare system, law enforcement, you know, getting rid of meth traffickers and that sort of thing. You know, exactly the same kinds of rural issues that are faced all over. So, you know, the native churches suffer under that same kind of thing as almost any other rural church does, that people need
Right.
to go elsewhere for opportunities to make a living.
That makes sense. Lynette is wondering, how were later groups of Mennonite immigrants who came to Kansas in the 20s and 40s received by Mennonites who'd been there since the 1870s? Was there tension with the various groups?
Well, like I said, here in this area, and I think much of the sort of 1870s settlement areas in the US, there were almost no 1920s and 40s immigrants, and so there wasn't really any sense of tension or that sort of thing. There just wasn't a large enough group for that kind of dynamic to get going.
Right. That makes sense. Just seeing if there are any easy questions left. Gladys is wondering, was there any content with the Chickasaw in Oklahoma with Mennonites?
That wasn't one of the tribes that
Okay.
Mennonites were involved with. I don't think any of the other Mennonite groups either. The Mennonite Brethren had a Comanche mission in southern Oklahoma, but I don't think any of the other Mennonite groups had a Chickasaw connection or any of the other so-called five tribes, Cherokee and so on, Muskogee and so on, the eastern Oklahoma.
Great. I'm just scanning to see if there are any questions to answer. Brenna's wondering, do you have information about Mennonites in Mountain Lake, Minnesota from the 1874 migration?
Well, we have things like church record books or copies of them, have papers of various families and individuals that have Mountain Lake connections. So, I mean, that sort of north-south access of Mountain Lake, Freeman, Beatrice and Henderson, Nebraska, Newton, then down into Oklahoma. That sort of the General Conference and MB Mennonite mental map for the Plains States.
Okay, so you do have some documents related to that. Great. Do you have any final comments you want to make before we sign off?
So.
Thank you so much. This was really great, really interesting. It's neat that you shared your personal story of connecting with the Hopi, and that was really meaningful. And you're obviously a very knowledgeable person. So cool that you're a software developer on the side. Maybe that funds your passion of doing the archival work.
It's about putting things in order, both archives and software.
Right. Code, you have to make code be obedient so that it does what it needs to do. Thanks again, John, and thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate you being here tonight. It was good fun, and we hope to see you next week. Bye now.